to go. No, I'm just okay. Good evening, everyone. So first of all, I bring you warm regards from Jerusalem, where I was just this morning. I literally landed 2 hours ago in Newark International Airport, in case you were interested. Straight from Tel Aviv. So this morning I was in Jerusalem, and here I am in New York. And Jerusalem, in its good old fashion, is filled with paradoxes. As a matter of fact, last night I gave a lecture there at an institute. And on one hand, Jerusalem is the holiest city in the world, as far as city goes. On the other hand, when something is very holy, the contrasts are also very glaring. So there's a lot of unholiness there too. And I don't necessarily mean in a decadent way, even just the complacency of walking the streets of a holy city. So you know the story in the Bible and the Torah when Jacob fell asleep in his journey from his parents' home. Vayetzi Yaakov Be'er-Sheva Vayelech Harana. In that chapter talks about how he went on his journey, and he fell asleep, and he had the famous dream, the dream with the ladder of the four rungs, and he sees the angels climbing and up and down. And then he suddenly awoke, and he was disturbed, very disturbed. Why? Because he did not recognize, as he writes, as he said, as the Torah writes, he did not feel and sense that this was a holy place. How could he sleep in a holy, sacred ground? And this was just, I don't know how many hours he slept, maybe it was just a few minutes. So even Jacob was very sensitive to the fact to fall asleep in a holy place is not a simple matter. So I can tell you that a lot of people are asleep in Jerusalem, not only physically, but also spiritually. Not to say in New York people are more awake, but here, being that it's not sacred ground, it's not quite as pronounced. So it's interesting to observe this paradox. At the same time, and for me, it's always great. I mean, for everybody actually goes there, it's always a very moving experience. Friday night, it's maybe the only shul in the world, the synagogue in the world, where you have literally every denomination, every group, all come to the same place. Synagogues with structures. Every synagogue has its personality, and other people don't come to those synagogues. And there you have all these minyanim and all these groups from the one size of a kippah to the next size, and different shtreimels and different hats and no hats and so on and so forth. So even though each community has its troubles and its challenges, as we all know, and its faults, but there's something beautiful when you see many of them, because in a way everyone contributes one piece of the puzzle. So no one group wants to acknowledge that, because every group thinks they have a monopoly on Judaism. But in truth, in a way, the Talmud says that Tzedakah HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shepizron Yisrael Ben Umes. Tzedakah HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael Shepizron Ben Umes, which means God did a great charity, a great tzedakah, a great chesed, a kindness to the Jewish people, that He spread them out among the nations. What exactly is this tzedakah? Spreading out among the nations is actually a curse. It's called the curse of exile, golus, of dispersion. And as we say in the Shemoneh Esrei and so many other places, v'kabetz nitchei Yisrael, for us we pray for and aspire to the day when all nations will be gathered, all Jews from all nations will be gathered back to the Holy Land. So how does the Talmud say that suddenly it's a tzedakah, that God spreads them all over? It's actually, it says, Mipnei chateinu galinu ma'artzeinu. It's because of our sins that we were exiled all over. And one of the answers is, there's the Kabbalistic and Hasidic answer that The tzedakah is shepizra b'ne'um, is that God spread out the sparks of holiness all over the world, and the Jews travel there to elevate those sparks. That's the Kabbalistic interpretation. But on a more practical level, one of the psychological benefits is when you have a world that's corrupt. So what's one of the best ways to immunize against corruption is to decentralize things. Because when power is centralized in one place, and that place gets corrupt, everything gets corrupt. So if you're able to create a situation where Jews are spread out all over the place, and no one controls a monopoly over it all, it actually can be a great blessing as an immunity to that corruption. So in the times of the temple, there was a Sanhedrin, it was a Supreme Court that was the central authority over all matters, essentially like the Supreme Court of the United States, the final authority. But even in this country, for instance, everyone knows really to run properly, you can't have everything centralized from Washington or from a Supreme Court, because different cities, different communities have different needs and have different standards. So there's a lot of power given to local courts and local jurisdictions and so on. So the same is true in a broader sense, that when the temple was destroyed, it wasn't just destroyed by accident, it was destroyed because the nation had become corrupt. It was either sinas chinam, baseless hatred, divisiveness between the Jews, which is what the Talmud says is the cause for the second temple's destruction. So when there's divisiveness, and if you allow control in any one rabbi or any one group, that control can create a lot of problems. So God did a tzedakah, a charity, by separating and said, you know what, I won't let anyone have one central power here. It'll be decentralized. Every community in the world will have its group. So on one hand, yes, it's a curse, because we'd love to be able to all be one and under one power like a Moses, but we don't have a Moses. When you don't have a Moses, you don't have a humble and truly godly leader, it's healthier that you don't have anyone with such absolute authority. That way there can also be no absolute corruption. And as a result, we have this decentralization, which is what the basis of Jewish communities are today. Different bezdins, different courts, and different authorities. And even then we know there's plenty of problems without the centralization. Imagine if it was all centralized. So you have different communities and different synagogues. I have been blessed to travel around the world many times, so I've seen different communities. And when you watch from the so-called outside to a certain extent, but you see there is a beauty when you see diversity like that, because everyone contributes something. Like I always like to say when I go to the Kabach Shul, that there's some synagogues where Rosh Hashanah looks like Simchas Torah. And then there's some synagogues where Simchas Torah looks like Rosh Hashanah. So if you have one of each, so you know you could so look at it like a smorgasbord of a menu of options, and we try to take pieces of the holiness each one has mastered. So some people are masters of Simcha, some people are masters of sadness, some people know how to do Tisha B'Av very well, and others do Purim very well. And those don't always go together. So it's good to have a little, I'm just saying this as also for ourselves, a little navigational tools as you navigate your way through the Jewish landscape. It's good to keep everything with a grain of salt and take the best from everywhere instead of putting all your eggs in one basket. I include the MLC in this as well, meaning that I think that there are a lot of great things you can find in many places. Some places don't have many great things, but many do. And if you can do it that way, in a way, it could be healthier. Without the usual, what I often hear is the disappointments that people have because of their heightened expectations. And once the honeymoon is over, so to speak, in their Jewish experience, they start seeing the cracks. Now, even in Jerusalem, I met some people from this class, many, many people actually that I know from here. And one of them tells me, he moved there, he got married. It's very disappointing because once you live in the community, you see day to day, he says, very petty, very divisive, very judgmental, which is usually the symptoms of a ghetto and the symptoms in general of people who are busy taking instead of giving. When you're in a position where you have to be mashpia, to give off light, you don't have time for getting into all the so-called pettiness, most call mikvenize. You know, the small kleinstädtliche politics, they call it, small town politics. Small town politics is always a result of a vacuum. So, anyway, as I said, regards from Jerusalem. Now we're here, Jerusalem, New York, via the web. I know people are watching it there, so I send back regards. It's just interesting It's 6,000 miles of flight, but just a few hours away after that all. Okay, so that's that. Now, as far as the theme of tonight's class, which by extension of what I just said, might as well, as a segue, tell you the following interesting medrash, which is a good way to launch the discussion tonight, which is called Desolation, the virtues of desolation, and the power of a vacuum, which is really based on this week's chapter, or actually the book. We begin now the fourth book of the Torah. It's called Bamidbar, which literally means in the desert, in the wilderness. God spoke to Moses, Bamidbar Sinai, in the wilderness, Sinai desert. So the entire chapter, as often is the case, the chapter is named at one of the words in the beginning of the chapter, Bamidbar. And in this case, not only the chapter, the entire fourth book, which is sometimes called Numbers, which is also named in Hebrew Sefer HaPkudim. That's another name for this book, because in this chapter, twice the Jews are counted. There's a census of the Jews in this chapter in Bamidbar, and then later in Parsha Pinchas, where there's a census. So there's another name for it, Sefer HaPkudim, the book of Numbers, meaning the book of counting, of a census. But the more official name is Bamidbar, which is also strange to call the name of a chapter and a book by almost a negative term. A midbar is a wilderness. What positive quality can there be in the wilderness, which we shall discuss. But it's also interesting that this chapter is always read before Shavuos. The Shabbos before Shavuos usually. Sometimes Naseh is read as well, but Bamidbar is always the Shabbos, always read before the holiday of Shavuos. As you know, the holiday of Shavuos, which will be next week, Friday and Saturday. So in other words, a week from this Friday will begin Shavuos. It's a 2-day holiday. It's always the 50th day from Passover. And the conclusion of the counting of the Omer leads into Shavuos. And Shavuos is the holiday when God gave the Torah at Sinai. So the Jews left Egypt on the 15th of Nisan, which is what we celebrate on Passover. And 50 days later, 43 days later, they arrived at Sinai. And 7 days later, Rosh Chodesh Sivan, they arrived at Sinai. And then 50 days from the day when they left Egypt, the 10 Commandments were given through Moses to the Jews at Sinai. And we celebrate that through Shavuos. And this chapter is always read, as it says in the Talmud, before Shavuos, which means that it has significance and a connection to the basic connection is obvious, because Midbar Sinai, the wilderness of Sinai, that's where Sinai took place. Why is it a Sinai wilderness? So at Mount Sinai, in the Sinai wilderness, was where the Torah was given. But obviously, it's definitely a deeper explanation of why this chapter and this book begins in the vicinity when we begin the holiday of Shavuos. So there's a very fascinating medrash, which I have often cited here. But it's extremely fascinating because you'll see its progressiveness, its progressive nature, where Jews were embracing principles of democracy and independence long before freedom, long before it became popular in the world. You have to remember, until emancipation, until 300 years ago, the concept of independence, Declaration of Independence, the idea that people have a say, that's a nation by the people, for the people, and not controlled by monarchs or certain individuals or the church, is a very modern institution. It's not more than 3 centuries old. French Revolution and the American Revolution. So you're talking about very recent in the context of history. But for the Jewish people, this was a principle that began when we left Egypt. The freedom from Egypt represents, as the Maharal of Prague says, that when the Jews left Egypt, they didn't just get out of bondage. They became fundamentally, he says, a free nation that no longer can ever have the mentality and the psyche of slaves. Or the words of the Torah in last week's chapter, Avodei atem v'le avodei la'avodim. God says, you are my servants, but not servants to my servants. So this isn't just a quantitative freedom, it's a qualitative freedom. It means you don't worship other human beings. You don't worship other creatures. You only worship the Creator. We are, in other words, we're truly free people. I know that sounds, to some may sound itself a contradiction of terms. If you worship God, you're not free. So maybe I'll address that in the context of our discussion. Maybe I won't. We'll see how it works out. But definitely when you are servant to another human being, clearly is the antithesis to what we call freedom. In this country, it was breaking the ties to England and King George. In other countries, and ultimately democracy, was breaking the ties to any monarch that has absolute authority. This is, as I said, a modern revelation that is just a few centuries old, that we don't serve human beings. There's no human being that has authority over another human being. This principle goes back for Jews over 3,000 years when they left Egypt, and why Mordechai would not bow to Haman, and Jews forever after that never again were able to become slaves mentality-wise, because they experienced what means true independence, that you do not serve another. As a matter of fact, the Torah, the whole law is about servants, avodim. In the chapter Mishpatim, so you may know this, the Torah says that when a person sells themselves into slavery because, let's say, they're unable to repay a theft or a debt, so you could think it's considered a virtue. It's not a virtue at all. If a person does that in order to repay a debt or repay something that they owe, so after 7 years, by the sabbatical, they're supposed to go free. If the person insists that they want to remain there, so the Torah does something which is completely antithetical to the Torah. The Torah is absolutely unacceptable, does not accept mutilation of a body. Not self-mutilation, not mutilating others. You're not allowed to touch a human body because a human body is considered the divine image. And even if a criminal, God forbid that you in any way scar the divine image, which is the body of a human being. So even the worst criminal who may hang, you cannot allow the person to hang overnight. And there are many laws that talk about tattoos or any other way of mutilating a body, even self-mutilation, because as the Radbaz says, you're not allowed to even mutilate yourself. You could say, well, it's my property. So he says, no, your body is not your property, it's God's property, and it's given to you on loan. So touching it is not your right in any destructive way. The only time where there's an exception is with this servant or this slave or eved who refuses to leave bondage. So they say you shall v'nirtza, you shall pierce his ear, because this ear heard at Sinai that you are my servant and not the servant of servants. And it's a reminder, in other words, it's basically a punishment, essentially, of a person who refuses to acknowledge, refuses to be independent. It sounds weird, but there are people who sometimes this can be almost a dysfunctional personality, where you become dependent on other people. So the Torah is so adamant that a human being be independent, that if someone insists to be dependent, so it's made very clear that they are defiling and defying God himself. And saying, you want to do that? Fine, you can do it, but you will always remain with a mark on your ear, that this ear that heard that you should be independent chose to be dependent. That itself is also an interesting lesson in life, psychologically. But what I was getting to was this medrash that I wanted to share with you, which asked the question, why was the Torah given at Sinai? So we're talking about the Mount Sinai, which is in the Midbar Sinai, in the wilderness. Why was the Torah given in the wilderness? We know that the Torah is considered to be God's treasure, called Chamud de Gnuza, Chem de Gnuza, the Talmud says in Shabbos, which means a hidden treasure of God's. A hidden treasure meaning the inner wisdom, the wisdom of the way God thinks. It's a great gift that God gives us, essentially a book that documents his mind, God's mind. To the extent that there's a whole debate actually in heaven, that the angels insist, why are you giving them, the lowly human beings, inferior human beings, your great gift, give it to us. Talmud has a whole interesting, fascinating dialogue where when Moses went up Mount Sinai, Shavuos, and God gave him the Torah, so the angels complained and said, why are you giving it to him? To the humans. Give it to us, we're far superior to the human race. So the story continues that God says to Moses, why didn't you answer them? Which is interesting. Moses should have said to God, what do you mean? You're the one that's giving it to us. Why don't you tell them why you're giving it to us? But God says to Moses, you explain to them why you have the right over the Torah. So Moses was afraid to answer, so God said, hold on to my throne. And Moses, as a good attorney, what he said was, let's open up the Torah and see what it says inside. What does it say inside the Torah? It says in the Ten Commandments, Kabed es avicha v'esimecha. Honor your parents. So he turned to the angels and said, do you have parents? And then it says there, Anechi Hashem Elokecha asher tzisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am your God that took you out of Egypt. He said, were you ever in bondage in Egypt? And it says, Le signav, don't steal. And Le sirtzach, don't murder. He said, do you ever have a temptation to steal or to murder? Basically, the whole Torah is not relevant to angels because the angels don't have any of these issues. It's not related to them. So, obviously, he prevailed. And there are long essays and discussions in Torah commentaries what the whole dialogue meant and what were the angels thinking. But there's no question the Torah is considered to be this hidden treasure. Now, if you were to give someone a special gift, someone you love, you want to give them a gift, what do you usually do? You find a place of beautiful ambiance, a nice restaurant, a nice sunset, waterfront, anything that's a beautiful environment and it's conducive for you to share something special with someone you love. What does God do? He gives the Torah in a wilderness. In a wilderness, no civilization, no restaurants around. Sunsets, there you want to escape the sun. We don't know the temperature in Mount Sinai when the Torah was given, but definitely was not cool. And this uncomfortable heat and unconducive to any civilization. There are many beautiful cities. Jerusalem is a beautiful city. If Jerusalem was too far because they weren't there yet, there's Alexandria. There are a lot of beautiful cities in the Middle East. So why did God choose, of all places, to schlep them out into a desert, in a place that's completely uncomfortable and has a scorching heat, no place to rest, and give them this great gift? So this is a question the Medrash asks. I embellished it a bit, but that's the essential question. And one of the answers given for it is extremely powerful and very contemporary answer. And the answer is because the Torah is a blueprint for all people, and God did not want anybody to lay claim on copyright of royalties over the Torah. Had it been given in Jerusalem, the Jerusalemites, every time we had a Torah class, till this day, they'd want a royalty. They say it belongs to Jerusalem. You want to study Torah? Okay, pay us 1%, or whatever it is. If it was given in another city, those dwellers would say that. By giving it in a midbar, in halacha, in Jewish law, a midbar is a mokum hefker. It's no man's land. And because it's no man's land, no one can lay claim to it. Now this may sound like a simple answer, but if you think about it, it's not simple at all. It's actually the essence of a free civilization. And the best way to demonstrate this, look around. You always want to know something. If you want to appreciate something in your life, it's always good to see the opposite. And sometimes we take for granted our gifts, our freedoms, our prosperity, our comforts. But when you look at someone who doesn't have them, you suddenly realize it's not so simple. Who doesn't take for granted that you breathe easily, without effort? But go to a hospital, God forbid, and you see someone struggling for every breath, you realize it's not just a simple thing. It's a miracle that we keep breathing all the time. Kol neshama neshama tahalal ka, the end of the book of Psalms. Kol neshima neshima, the Medrash says. Every breath you take, you should be praising God, because it's a gift, it's a blessing. So we take for granted many things. So if you really want to appreciate so-called freedom, and this Medrash, let's look at the opposite. What's the first thing that any totalitarian regime does when it comes into power? Well, any monarch, any despot, any dictator, fascist, one of the first things they'll always do is they'll create a Bureau of Truth and Information. So you could rest assured, if someone establishes a Bureau of Truth and Information, it's usually neither true nor information. You see this consistently. Look at Nazi Germany, the methodical approach. The first thing was to control the press, to control the flow of information. Because when you control the flow of information, you control it's mind control. You control what people are thinking, what they're hearing, what they think are facts. And then you can start feeding them anything you want to feed them. And more importantly, the truth never gets to them because you block it. This is called censorship. And this is why this is why you'll see consistently the same thing in the communism and the same thing in any system. You want to control, you have to control information, the news, the airwaves, the newspapers. Many people say, cumulatively, what ultimately brought down the Soviet Union was a thing called Radio Free Europe. There was no internet in those days, but there was radio. And there was constant broadcasts of radio called Radio Free Europe. It was broadcasts that talked about another culture. And Russians were always told something that wasn't even true. I remember when my father was who was a journalist, probably is somewhere still in heaven, but I don't know if they need journalists up there. But when he went to Russia, he brought back an English newspaper. They printed an English newspaper there. And I couldn't believe the propaganda. The front page had a picture of New York City. Now this was like, and they said this is central New York City. This is like Midtown. And the picture was literally like a desolate town that looked burned out, looked like nobody was living there. The lights were out, like there's this dark street, and they say New York has completely been abandoned due to crime and corruption. This is a front page story with a headline. So you read a newspaper, you don't have any other newspaper to dispute it, and you're fed a diet of such information. What happens? After a while, you start believing it. Why, who would print such a lie? You know, like they say, the bigger the lie, the more it's accepted. But this, I saw it with my own eyes. And this we take for granted because we don't have a situation like that. Even though some people say America has plenty of its own censorship, but it's another discussion. So if you want to appreciate this medrash, just think of what was going on in history. When Galileo made his announcement about his observations of celestial bodies, the church forced him to recant because it disputed their version. So in other words, information, truth, the flow of what we call free inquiry, which is, as I said, a relatively new concept, was fundamental to Torah. And that's why God did not want to give the Torah in any city. And in fact, not give it through any human beings, really, who in any way could distort its message. So then you may ask, so why was Moses involved? Well, that's why Moses was Moses. It wasn't about him. He was the only man that stood up to the test of absolute humility, so he didn't get in the way of transmitting the information. But the bottom line is, this medrash is teaching us the secret to truth. What it means today, in simple terms, is, as I began this discussion about Jerusalem, you go to different synagogues, you have different rabbis, and the question I'm often asked, one of the most common questions, is which rabbi can you trust? Which one should I turn to? This one says that one is a low life. That one, we ask him about this one, he says he's a low. You should hear what you should know. If he says that's what he says, you should know what he's all about. And you have people who are mudslingers one way or the other. Some do it subtler fashion. Some do it very openly. And you have everybody criticizing everybody practically. As I said, but some do it very directly. Some do it very subtly. But it's all over the place. So when you're starting to wonder who should I turn to, it's a very good question. So this medrash gives us a very interesting answer. The Torah doesn't belong to anybody. Not to any rabbis, not to any rebbes, not to any group, not to any individual. It's Torah precisely because it's not belonging to. If it was a man-made thing, why would we follow it? If it's your system of one group, why would another group follow that group's guidelines? It's only because it's a divine blueprint, a divine wisdom that is universal and belongs to everyone equally. Or better put, doesn't belong to anybody really. Because as soon as it becomes controlled by human beings, how can you trust its message? Human beings can distort its message. We all are subjective human beings, and in our self-interest, we can decide to apply Torah in a way that serves our interests. So it's critical that the Torah had to be immunized from so-called man-made touch, because if not, you cannot trust its truth. Now, this is another discussion, really deserves another evening, which I'm not going to get into this tonight. Maybe next week before Shavuos we'll talk about it. So how do we know that the Torah that we're studying today, that was passed on to us by teachers, who received it from teachers before them, all the way back to Moses, how do we know this is not some way distorted by men? And many people actually make that claim. How was it preserved? And the answers are quite fascinating, actually. That if it's truly divine, God had to build in some type of immunity system that would allow the Torah to reject distortions of it. In other words, the first thing, always know, there's no rabbi that owns the Torah. And I've always given people a litmus test. If you're ever in a situation where you want to know whether the rabbi is living up to what his obligation is, so the test is a very simple one. If you hear something that disturbs you, so in a respectful way, ask the person who taught it or preached it, or the rabbi that told it to you, ask them in a respectful way, very nicely, what is your source? And you'll have one rabbi that will answer, one type of rabbi will answer, either with their body language or with words, what chutzpah do you have to ask me my source? Who are you? You're like a ignoramus. You're asking me my source? There's certain people who give you that message. I'm das Torah. I am Torah. How are you? What right do you have to ask me? Then there's a second type that says, I don't have a source. I thought of it this morning in the shower, or just my own idea, innovation. And then there's the third, and this is only the legitimate one, that the Torah itself says this is how a true rabbi should answer. That the rabbi will humbly show you their sources and show you how they interpreted a source or applied it and so on. In other words, no different than the scientific method, which is you have to be able to replicate a claim. If a scientist says that I experimented in a laboratory and came to certain conclusions, the first fundamental principle is that this has to be able to be replicated by other scientists, because people are invested sometimes in their own conclusions. They may even be corrupt, and we find this quite often. It has to be replicated. You have to be able to show what was your formula, how did you use it, that others can copy it. So there's a concept, mehechen dantuni. We have the right to ask a rabbi, even the greatest rabbi, even Moses himself, where did you derive this conclusion? When you ruled a certain halachic ruling, where did you get it from? And I don't mean just in order to be chutzpah or brazenly just challenge, is because in order to keep people honest, the reality check is everything has to have a source. And that's what we all are subject to that. The rabbis and lay people alike, all are subject to the same sources. Nobody is the source of their own source. Everyone who is the greatest authorities are always people who quoted a source before them. And that's why you'll find in many halachic rulings from a bezdin, you'll see they'll always give you footnotes at the bottom. Even though it's not necessary, but in order to preempt the question that some people may have is where does it come from? So it's based on precedent, based on different sources. So applying this to us on a psychological level, what this really means, it's also the concept of respect. The respect. It is true that we should respect our elders, and we should respect people who are scholars, and people who have, especially if they've inspired and affected us. That's why we stand up for a person who is a Talmud Chacham, a scholar, especially someone who taught you Torah. There's a respect. You stand up, not for the person. It's not an ego trip. It's for the wisdom of God that this person had the merit to share with you, or to share with others. So we are honoring God, really, not any human being. So there's no question there's that element of respect. But remember, respect goes two ways. If a person truly has Torah inside of them, they also will respect the divine image that each person has created, and including people who may not be so knowledgeable. So to say someone who's more knowledgeable, so called, has a better tzelem elokim, has a more superior divine image, is absolutely untrue. It's true some people's souls shine through more than others, more transparent than others. And they've worked on it more, so we respect that. But respect is a universal thing, and that's what the Torah is saying, that was given in the wilderness, because all of us are on a dignified journey called your soul's journey. And when your soul was sent down to this earth, it's God himself who chose that soul. Every individual soul, there's no soul that is less treated with less attention than another. It's like a mother, a healthy mother, has 20 children, has one child. You think the love is different? Some people think if you have one child, you could put all your 100% of your love you give to that one child. You have 20 children, you have to split up the love into 20 parts. But love is not a physical commodity. It's not like a piece of food that if you cut it into 20 parts, you don't get enough food. It doesn't work that way. It's like one mother once told somebody who asked her that question, how could you love your 20, it wasn't 20, it was 11 children with equal love? So she said, love is like the sun. The sun gives sunshine, warms millions of people, billions of people. Does one person get less sunlight because there are more people on earth? It doesn't work that way. The sun reflects itself in every drop of water equally. So love is a type of force that is not divisible by quantity. And God forbid, if a parent in any way, one child is hurting, it's not like you say, oh, if you have 20 children, well, it's a big thing. It's only 1/20th of your family. It doesn't work that way. Because life is a qualitative thing. And just a simple example from our own bodies. If you have, God forbid, a little pain in your toe, you don't say it's only my toe. If I had it in my head, I would have a big problem. A toenail can be just as much problematic as a headache. It's true that some, God forbid, some pains are more dangerous than others. But it has nothing to do with anything. One cell in your body, out of the 75 trillion cells, is, God forbid, mutated. Not in anyone's body here, but I mean conceptually. It doesn't matter where that cell is and what part of the body. So there are things that are completely qualitative, not quantitative. And that is the fundamental principle that when the Torah was given to everybody equally. Obviously, there were those that, like Moses himself and the other teachers who were more qualified and more humble in a way, who knew how to teach it. That's already a methodology. It's a mastery of a method that they worked on. Not everybody necessarily has earned that right. That comes with work. It doesn't just happen. But the principle that everybody is equal was established where? In a wilderness, of all places. Because had it been a civilization, then civilization, you right away have class systems. In the desert, everybody is suffering the same way, the same heat. There's no comfort zones. So we're all equalized. It's like the grand equalizer. As soon as you're in a situation, even of beauty, so there are people who have more and people who have less. So God chose to give the Torah specifically in a place that was barren of all man-made structures and all the hierarchies and all the different distinctions that in any way would distort this universal quality that had to be transmitted. So this brings me to the topic of the name of Bamidbar itself and its meaning and its significance. So usually you think in terms of a wilderness, a desert, especially in context of the globe that we live in. So we know they say there's three types of so-called climates. There's a desert climate, an arid, dry heat. There's the climates of cold climates, and there are watery climates. There are probably more climates in the world. Usually civilization does not take place in the desert, even though you have Bedouins and nomads and others that live in particular deserts, but generally it's not conducive to build. Firstly, people need water. Without water, there can't be real life, so a normal standard of life. So you'll see most big cities are on water or have some way access to water. Even the times of the Bible, whether it was Be'eris, which was wells that were dug up, but water is a vital thing. New York is not a major city by accident. You'll see almost every major city is usually near water. Not just for trade, but also because people gravitate there because it's easier to deal with challenges like droughts and other stuff like that. And so when you talk about a wilderness in general, just technically speaking, it's usually referred to in a very negative way. Not a place of civilization, not a place where people hang out, not easy to hang out, not easy to survive in a wilderness. Okay. Yet it says in this week's chapter in Likutei Torah, which is a book of Hasidic thought, that Bamidbar, actually the verse in Yecheskel, I think it is, Bamidbar is lo yoshev adam sham. A wilderness is a place where human beings do not dwell. See, it has two interpretations of that. One, a negative one, as I just spelled out, that humans don't hang around. It's arid, it's dry, it's not conducive to civilization, civilized life. But he also says, Lo yashav adam sham, he interprets in a positive light, which is that a wilderness is not limited to the structure of Adam, of a human being. It's above it. So in Kabbalistic and Hasidic thought, there's the concept of structure. Is structure a good thing or a negative thing? So we know that, for instance, the rebellion of the 60s And in general, when a person is so-called on a transcendent journey, one of the elements of transcendence is to get beyond structures, especially man-made structures. So in that sense, there's a certain dimension that the Kabbalah talks about that is beyond structure in a positive way. So in other words, it could be beyond structure in two different ways. One negatively, it's lower than structure, and one is higher than structure. To give you an example would be, I'll use the example from the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov says, he explains, Tefillah la'ani, one should pray like a pauper. And he asked the question, why like a pauper? And he gives the analogy of two people who were invited to see a king, a great king. One was a educated, literate, sophisticated aristocrat, and the second was a ignorant, illiterate person. So first comes the educated man, and he goes into this palace. He's never seen a palace of such beauty, the collection of literature, music, art. He's so enamored by the glory and by the magnificence of the king's collections that he misses his appointment. He gets stuck in those chambers. Then comes the literate pauper, being that he never was educated, had no idea what music was, didn't appreciate any of this. He walked through all those halls and goes right into the king's chamber and asks for all his needs, including, obviously, the ability to appreciate all this wisdom and knowledge and sophistication. So the Baal Shem Tov says that when you stand before God, before the king, suspend your structures, suspend your sophistication, and stand like an innocent child, like a pauper. And then you can appreciate the purity and essence of the divine. Whereas if you come with all your tools and all your developed skills, then all you'll get from God is also God's skills. So in using Hasidic terminology, there's, in other words, two dimensions to experience spirituality, or the divine. One is called Giluyim, the expression of the divine. And then is experiencing the essence of the divine. And the essence is very simple, and only can be accessed through simplicity. And on a personal level, when you really love somebody, what do you love really? Where's the deepest expression of love? In very profound conversations you have, stimulating intellectual discussions, different forms of expression, of romance, and so on? Or is it sometimes, on the deepest level, almost in silence, in a place that doesn't even have expression? Where would you say it's more profound? So intuitively or initially we would think the more expressive it is, in this world expression matters. Something is expressed in words, in actions, in behavior. That has much more intensity, but that's not so. The most intense things in life don't have much expression. When two people embrace and they don't even say anything, can have much more profound intimacy and love than when there are many words used. Obviously, being that we do live in a world where we have different opinions and don't always understand each other, you need both. You can't just say, when people love each other, they say, what's on your mind? Nothing, And then you say, well, the deepest love is not expressed in words. Robert Jacobson said so in the class, like that. So don't blame it on me. Sometimes you have to express the inexpressible too, because another person may not feel that. They may not be there. But when the full picture is there, when the communication is there, and the basics are in place, and there is the expression of it. There are people who love each other, and they show no expression. They don't see each other for a year, and they say, I love you anyway, even though I never buy you a gift, I never see you, I never talk to you. That's not what we're talking about. If the structure is there, you'll always find that which is beyond structure is always more profound. In a way, you could also say the structure helps you build to a place that's beyond structure. So in a way, you begin with the communication, but ultimately the embrace or the intimate moment is one that's beyond words. All deepest things don't have expression. So what the Baal Shem Tov is saying, the same is true in our relationship with God. You can have a relationship with God's so-called props, a beautiful nature, the elegance of the universe. But these are, they say, God's fingertips. They're not the essence. The essence doesn't have that expression. So, if you want to appreciate God's literacy or wisdom, you do so through study and through intelligence. But if you want to appreciate God's essence, you do through simplicity and innocence, faith, basically. So sometimes the innocence of a little child has more power than the sophistication of an adult. Our role, of course, is to bridge the two, and that's what our ultimate purpose is. But it's critical to know that you need both. Often we turn into adults, we become so sophisticated, too sophisticated even for ourselves, and we lose that innocence. The most beautiful things you'll see in life is those that have both. That their intelligence never gets in the way and never becomes a trap. It's only a station to reach a deeper experience. So when the Jews left Egypt and they said to God, now we'd like to accept the mitzvahs that you have. So God, interestingly, didn't tell them, okay, I'll give you the Torah and mitzvahs. He said this statement. Listen to this. He said, Kablu malchusai, va'achar kach kablu gzereisai. First accept me, my sovereignty, and then you'll accept my rules, my guidelines, which simply means a very, very fundamental truth. I don't need you to follow what I ask you to do. I want you to accept me. If you accept me in my entirety, then I know that you're going to follow what I asked you to do. When you find people who are truly in love and truly committed to each other, it's like say, you know what, everything you ask me to do, I do. It's because there's a fundamental acceptance of the other person, beyond the details. Then you know the details will follow. And we know for ourselves, when someone loves you, you want, or you expect to love, what do you expect? You want them to accept you as in your entirety, with your flaws, with your ups and downs, with your pros and cons. You, your essence, your whole being. And that being is not expressed necessarily in details. And then what follows from that is, if you accept someone that way, for example, a business contract, you don't need that. In businesses, the only reason you have contracts, like the guy says, the only reason you take partners in your business is not because you like them, because you can't do it without them. So in business, no one's asking you to accept. You have to accept the essence of the other company or the other individual you're doing business with. There's a contract, there are guidelines, this is what my obligation is to you. I'm talking about ethical agreements. Ethical agreement doesn't have to require that I have to accept you in your entirety. I accept certain things. Here's what your rights, here are my rights, here's the investment, here's the return, the whole agreement. But love is a different story. Love is of complete acceptance. Think of a parent accepting a child, only a part of the child. Only when the child behaves, or like a guy sitting with me, a couple were sitting with me, and the woman was saying, I love you unconditionally. And he says, I also love you unconditionally. As long as you do certain things, I love you unconditionally. It took a while to explain to him that's a little contradiction, but we're still in the middle of the explanation. Trust. So the point being is that there is an element of essence that's beyond structure. So to go back to the concept of the wilderness. So desolation on one hand can appear very negative. You know, you're living in a very thriving metropolis where there's vegetation and growth and water and all the elements necessary for a thriving community, civilization. And then you enter into a desert, not exactly a pleasant journey. Yet you find that 90% of the Torah is a journey through a desert. Besides the book of Genesis and most of the book of Exodus, the rest of the Torah is all about the Jews' 40 years journey through the desert, through the wilderness. And the Torah was given there, and most major events happened there. So these 40 years in the wilderness occupy 3 books of the entire Torah. So it's not a small matter. The question is why. So all kinds of explanations are given. Why couldn't God take him straight to Israel? There were shortcuts, 40 years, so there was the punishments, there was all kinds of explanations. But still, the big question begs is, what is the lesson for that? What is the lesson for us? If we look at the Torah as a blueprint of life, does it mean that we all have to go through a desert in our lives? And the answer, my friends, is yes, we do. This doesn't necessarily mean a cursed form of it, but we have to go through some form of meltdown of existing structures if you ever want to discover a higher purpose. So let me introduce to you a concept from the Kabbalah, which some of you may be familiar with, or maybe not. And even if you are, it's always good to refresh ourselves. This concept in Hebrew words is called 3 steps. There are 3 fundamental steps to every process of growth. And they're called yesh, ayin, and yesh. If you're writing it down, it's in Hebrew, yesh is yud shin, and ayin is aleph yud nun. Or the transliteration is yesh, ayin is ayin, and then yesh. What it means is yesh means a state of being. Ayin is a vacuum, or a void, and yesh is another state of being. So if you think of it like this, the caterpillar would be a yesh. The cocoon, or the chrysalis, when the caterpillar goes into its cocoon, is like a state of ayin. The caterpillar ceases to be. And the butterfly is the new result through this metamorphosis. Every process of growth goes through this type of metamorphosis. Some very obvious, and some less obvious. So you take a seed, you plant it in the ground. If you observe it, it has to lose its form and it decays in the ground. Some way, mysteriously, it combines with earth, with water, and suddenly you see, after a little while, a sapling begin to emerge, which can end up becoming a big tree. And you look at a tree growing, think of it, it all began from a seed that once was besides that it was minuscule, the seed no longer exists. Where's the seed? But it was all there contained in the seed, in a microcosm. It was all there contained. The same thing is in the seed of our lives. So when the seed fertilizes an ovary and egg, and then you have the birth of a child, it's miraculous, but it's the same process. It begins in one form, goes through a form of a vacuum and a void, and then emerges in another form. And more practical, or I guess, in just the creative process. Anyone involved in any creative process, whether it's writing, art, music, a business plan even. So you do a lot of research, you come up with an idea, you do a lot of research, you usually go through a lot of confusion, and then something starts to emerge. Creativity is always a child of frustration, and the greater the creativity, the greater the frustration that precedes it. Anyone who's done writing, anyone who's created anything, will tell you there's a period where it's pretty much murder, very difficult. You get to a point where you don't think you can even make it. But you just forge ahead. Some don't, and then, they don't see it through, and it doesn't get anywhere. Seeing it through is even more important than the concept. Because it's like the fertilization, it's the, what's the word I want to use? It's the gestation of the seed that's put into the ground, and it takes time, and you water it, and you nurture it, and then it turns into something. And the greater the growth, the greater the result, it always results from a deeper pain. You can even say a vacuum. So what's the purpose of the vacuum? Let's analyze, dissect the vacuum state, the void. If you were able to go into the mind of a caterpillar, what is it thinking when the cocoon begins to close up? So it must be thinking that it's getting dark, and it's getting darker, and then the next thing is I will no longer exist. Literally death. Does the caterpillar know that it's going to turn into a butterfly? So I've never interviewed a caterpillar, so I can't tell you. But look at ourselves. What happens when people go through a state of a meltdown? So we have one today, economic, psychological ones, when people are overcome by fear and insecurity. Anybody ever have a situation like that? Yeah. Okay, one person at least. You're not alone, trust me. Okay, you can laugh, that's good, not everybody laughs. So we all have situations where you're overcome by doubt, insecurity, what's going to happen. Sometimes it turns out nothing, and it's almost like it is funny in retrospect that you were so afraid. But sometimes it's not that way. Sometimes it doesn't turn out so fine. And sometimes we don't even know how it turns out. We're still in the middle of it. I mean, obviously in the area of relationships, everybody has this. You get into a relationship, immediately you're right now dependent on another person. What are they thinking? Are they in love with me as much as I'm with them? You know, what are they doing? the more committed you are, the more vulnerable you get, the more fragile you are in a way. So, about a lot of unknowns, doubts, insecurities. Ein simcha ka'ataras hasfekis. There's no joy like the one of resolving doubts. You know what doubt can do to a person? It can destroy us. The doubt. Sometimes even making a decision that may end up being the wrong decision is better than being paralyzed by doubt the rest of your life. Be an offense. So at least a move was made. And then you learn it was the wrong move, fine. I'm not saying every situation, obviously you have to consider. But we live in a world where they say, Kol hadrachim b'cheskes sakana. All the paths are dangerous paths. What does it mean dangerous? Are they all dangerous? No, but they're all possibly dangerous. You take a path in life, you know no way that you'll know what's going to happen. A young guy, young, he's in his late 20s, relatively young, has to make the decision to get married. He's been dating this girl for a long time, and they both love each other, feel they love each other. And his biggest question, he says to me, how do I know? How do I know the future? What's going to happen? No, she seems like a fine girl, but things happen. Curveballs are thrown. People have children. Different challenges happen. Things that are not always in your control. Not always man-made problems. So what I told him, what I usually tell people in that situation, is something, of course you never know. No one knows the future. What you know is, you have the tools to deal with anything that will come up in the future. Is this woman, I told him, a person you feel, a partner, that no matter what comes up, you know you can talk to her about it. And she can talk to you about it. That's all you can really do. It's like, in other words, you prepare all your tools. If someone you're sitting with and you don't feel you can talk to them, so obviously if something, God forbid, will come up, you're not going to have anyone to talk to. It's like a trust that has to be built. And there's no guarantees because, God forbid, a lot of things happen. Things I don't even want to mention. There are people who make all the right decisions and then something happens to the person they love, health-wise, that was not in anyone's control. What do you do then? So, of course, there's the risk. There's the risk that you might fall in love with someone that, God forbid, will die prematurely. I don't even want to mention these things. I'm just mentioning them simply just to bring it down, to make the point. So we all live in a world where the future is in doubt all the time. Yet you see people who are extremely happy people, and not because they're naive or stupid or blind and they don't look, is because they have confidence in their tools. It's like a soldier that is trained to go to war. You know that training is 99% of the time. Most soldiers never go to a real war. But they train and train and train. The day comes, they've been trained, so they feel confident, I have the tools. You'll see this in any type of situation. As a writer, I can tell you, it all comes down to the disciplines that you've developed. So the day comes when you're pressured, you feel confident you can do it, even though it's difficult, because you have trained yourself. And then you get into the zone, and so on. So when it comes to life and challenges, we all have many, many areas of doubts. So desolation, or using the word midbar, we all will go through a midbar in our lives. But you have to understand, if you dissect that state, yes, on its own, it can seem devastating. It can seem terrifying. Like not knowing where you are, you're in the middle of a wilderness, lost. Let's talk psychologically. What's a psychological wilderness? We have no clue what to do. Confusion, nothing to hold on to, no signposts. Like a real wilderness. Wilderness, there's nowhere to turn. You don't know whether what's east, west, south, north. There's no water. You feel alone. You feel no one understands you. There's many ways to define the midbar in psychological and personal terms. But above all, no matter what form it takes, it's a form that can be very, very demoralizing. But, with one big but, if you see it as an entity of its own, which is why it's vital that, as the Kabbalists put it, that it's a journey. The key thing to know in the Torah is not they ended up in a wilderness, it's a journey through a wilderness. That's what the Torah is telling us. If it was like a story, that God sent them to the wilderness and they got stuck there and that's it. Even though the Torah ends in the wilderness, but it ends in a journey they started in one place, and now they're at the border, Marava, the east border of the Jordan, about to enter the Promised Land. But the fact is the Torah doesn't even get into the Promised Land. Moses never enters, neither do the people in this book. in this Torah. It only happens in the book of Joshua. But the Torah made its point. They went through the wilderness, and we all will go through one or another. In an interesting way, as we'll discuss briefly soon, we choose what kind of wilderness we'll go through. Some will be worse than others. But there's no such thing. There's no one on this earth that will be preserved from having to be challenged through some wilderness in their life. What's the first initial wilderness of all? It's the trauma of birth. When a soul comes down to this earth, it cries when it leaves its mother's womb. Every child cries. So some say, doctors say, it's the gasp of oxygen, a breath, to begin to breathe. Remember, in the mother's womb, the child is not breathing. The child is being fed and nourished by its mother, and then that comes out on its own. So it's like the first gasp of breath. But the Kabbalists say the child cries because it sees the world it's entering, and it sees the world it's leaving. And the world it's leaving is obviously a far more healthy one, a far more beautiful one. And the world it's entering is a wilderness. So in its own way, the trauma of birth is the first wilderness we enter. And the second one will be the first time we will be disappointed or be hurt by life. Whether it's from our parents, our education systems, or later in life. Hopefully the second one will happen a lot later than earlier. And through childhood we will be more protected. But it doesn't always happen that way, as we know. Sadly, many children enter a wilderness far too early. But even those that don't, and did grow up in healthy, nurturing, and called sheltered homes, in a healthy way sheltered, there will be a point when you leave your home. And there will be a point when you will start seeing the world and start seeing some of the cruelty and the injustices and the unfairness and many things that are not very pleasant. So there are many wildernesses we're going to go through our lives. Physical ones, psychological ones for sure, emotional ones. And obviously, as they say, Yosef Das, Yosef Mechev, the more you know, the more painful, more pain it is. Ignorance is bliss, and knowledge is painful. Awareness is painful, that's what it means. You're aware, there's a pain in awareness. Sometimes enviable to have a little animal bliss, but it doesn't always work that way. That's something not in our control. So the concept of the Bamidbar, of this chapter, this book, can be applied in many ways. But the key of everything is, in all of this, is understanding the process. The pain of it is in direct proportion to the recognition of its process. Those that know, for instance, that creativity is a child of frustration. Look at, for instance, coaches, whether it's writing coaches, even sports coaches. What's a good coach? It's usually someone who himself or herself went through the experience that they're coaching you. I know there are consultants that never did what they're giving others consultation, but we're talking about the good ones have experience. What their experience, what's the value of their experience? The value of their experience, above all, is that they've seen the downside, and they can tell you, I've been there, and you can get through it. And they don't say it just with words. You know that they were in that situation. People who've, in some way, excelled in some area, and they had to go through some wilderness. When they speak to you, you feel it resonates because you see they've been there. There's nothing stronger than hearing someone who was on this journey before you and made it through. This is really, if you want, the essence of why the 12-step programs work so well, because there's some power of synergy when you're with other people who have healed or are healing as you are. There's nothing like seeing another human being in a situation like your own. The Talmud actually says it in its own way. It says, "Hamispal ba'at chavere hu nenet chila," that when you're in need for something and you pray for someone else who has that need, you will get a response first. Meaning that if you empathize with another in a situation, it has its bounce back effect that helps you in that situation. Why? It's not just a zgula. God blesses you because you prayed for someone else. God blesses you. So then you can pray for someone else that's not in your situation. Because there's something about the human race that we relate to problems in others, because it's like a mirror image, as the Baal Shem Tov says. Or if you wish, we're all part of one organism. So if one organism is in a certain way and you relate to it, we affect each other in that way. You know, the negative side is like misery loves company, right? Joy also loves company. So when you have a situation where a person is in need and you're able to help them, which sometimes is easier than helping yourself, it comes back to help you as well. So the Midbar desolation that the Torah talks about is about really reaching a place beyond the structure of your life. Comfort zone is always to stay where you are. But growth is impossible to be where you are. Just not possible. You want to remain a caterpillar your whole life. That's one thing. But if you want to become a butterfly, there's no way out but to close the past and move to another future. And there's always going to be a measure of desolation or loss or some way, some metamorphosis means that something previous, a layer of skin has to be shed for a new layer of skin to be assumed. There's no way around that. Is that moment painful? It could be painful. Or if you see it as a process, you understand it and you prepare that way psychologically, you prepare for it and you can ride through it. That's the bottom line. So even in situations, for instance, now we're going through an economic meltdown, some call it. They don't want to use the word depression, so they call it the Great Recession. Great Recession sounds like depression to me, but they call it the Great Recession or the economy. And of course, nobody has a clue what's going to happen next. Anything can happen. You know, can anyone say that the United States won't declare bankruptcy because at some point they don't have the gold that backs up these trillions of dollars? Nobody wants to utter this possibility because then what? What's the next recourse? Who do we turn to next? Rome? After the United States. So dealing with all the experts have been proven or really have nothing to say. There's a lot of experimentation going on. So it's very obvious and very natural that there should be a lot of fear and uncertainty. Not even getting into whether there's money or not. Even people who have money are uncertain what's going to happen next. And it's very possible that just as capitalism was born, it could also die. You know, everything that's born can die. There was a world before it. There could be a world after it. Now, what will replace it? I don't know if it will be socialism, but perhaps there'll be called capitalism, just like there's Web 2 and Web 3, maybe capitalism 2, capitalism 3. Maybe it has to go through a whole reality check, because this time it's not just about markets bouncing back. We also have an erosion of the essence of all capitalism, which is trust. There's no trust, there's no lending. There's no lending, there's no economy growth, at least not the way, the models we understood it. And trust is not so simple to regain once it's been betrayed. You know, if one guy could have fooled so many, how do you know, why would you give your money to somebody else? How do you know they're not fooling you? We don't have an SEC that is like a divine authority that we can trust. So it's a lot of problems if you really want to dissect it. Frankly, it does not depress me, first of all, because I have no portfolios to lose, so that's number one. So I don't have all these issues, thank God. When you have nothing to lose, as our good old Shabtai Zusha Zimmerman tells us. The Hebrew name for Bob Dylan. But above all, there's a different reason for that. As a Jew, I could share with you that we have seen the abyss many times, and much bigger ones than economic distress, bigger abysses. And what Jews always knew, that everything is a process. There may be a great blessing in disguise here. You know, greed at some point self-destructs. That, I think, is a blessing. If it doesn't self-destruct, I would be disturbed, because that means that it can go and go on. Greed becomes a dominant force. Greed doesn't work. And ultimately, it's going to hurt you. If you're greedy and you think it's only going to hurt others, it ends up hurting you too. And perhaps this will ultimately, so-called, go through a market correction, no pun intended, and perhaps create a new economy. If you believe in the spirit of the human race, and you believe in the spirit of progress, what you see through history, one thing is for sure. Everything that was destroyed always has led to a better situation. And I don't know if you know this, but recently I read this, and I was quite fascinated by it. Capitalism, and what we can call the modern economy, modern democracy even, what is directly attributed to, of all things, the Black Plague. So everybody knows about the Black Plague. A third of Europe died. You're talking about millions and millions of people. And it was considered to be what we call the Dark Ages, a lot of it because of the plague. It was a plague that ravaged the Western world and destroyed almost over a third of its population, if not more. I don't remember even exactly, maybe 40%. There was no family that did not have ein bayis b'lo mesa, as they say. No home did not have a death. So if you think of it on its own, it seems like one of the most devastating things. It actually also affected Jews tremendously. But I just read recently, and with an authoritative source, it's not a theory, it's actually proven. You know what happened as a result in the after effect of the Black Plague was it changed the whole balance of the economic infrastructure. Because obviously when 40% of a population die, it's evenly distributed between owners and workers. So most of the people were workers. So suddenly there was a drought, there was a shortage of work. What happens in supply and demand when you need more? When you need the workers more than there's not enough of them, they get more power. That empowered the lay people against their lords and the landowners and all the despots of the time, because they started demanding higher wages. This was the beginning of the conditions that led to capitalism as we know it. So there are many great things that we make great. Many things like, who said it? I think it was Balzac, the thinker, the philosopher, who said that every great fortune is born out of a great crime. How do you like that one? Every great fortune was born out of a great crime. So when you see something that's really glowing, you have to also know what its roots are. Sometimes, and I'm not in any way justifying the plague or any death, but it's interesting that when we look at growth and we see things flourishing, it's not so black and white. We're coming in the middle of the story or the end of the story. You look at the whole film, it's not always not that beautiful. The United States itself, yes, has many virtues. For the Jewish people, it's been a haven for so many nations, so many immigrants that came here. But the fact is, this nation was born. Yes, it destroyed the native people here. Did they have to destroy them? I don't know about that, but that's what they did. And again, I'm not here to justify, not justify. You could say that's the story of history in general. People came and destroyed old cultures that are no longer existent because new people came in. You know, in the case of the United States, it was done in the name of all kinds of divine reasons. They saw Israel, they saw America as the new promised land. Hebrew was even a consideration to become the language of this country. Do you know that? Yeah. So everything has a bigger story, but on a personal level, it's very hard to deal with. Because it's one thing if you say, okay, a caterpillar may or may not know it's going to turn into a butterfly, but we are observers. We're not the caterpillar, so we don't feel the pain. But when you're going through it, it's a whole different story. As we all know, it's very easy to give advice to others. That when in a painful situation, it's a metamorphosis, you're growing, and stuff like that. So the only thing I can really say about that is to know that we're not alone, which is why we read this chapter now, and why it's so significant to our lives, and why we read it before Shavuos. If we are to excel and reach places beyond ourselves, there's only one way. That the way you see yourself has to some way, I don't want to say be destroyed, but it has to be challenged. Because as long as you maintain your perspectives that you had today or yesterday, then whatever you have tomorrow will just be an extension of yesterday. If a human being wants to find a bright future, one element is you have to let go of the past. This doesn't mean entire letting go. It means at least to some extent. This is called in Hebrew, that ayin that I said before, the bittul, the state of vacuum or the void that always will be there between two states of being. Now, I don't know if you've ever had an epiphany, but I mean an epiphany where you recognize that you were absolutely wrong about something. It's a very, at the moment, can be very shocking and shake you up. But afterwards, it's one of the most exhilarating experiences because it gives you the courage and the confidence to know that you can learn something completely new. It's like you had a certain stereotype or a certain perspective on something, and whatever it was, whether it was a painful situation or something else, and you learn something completely new. Often this happens in situations where you think somebody doesn't like you, and you discover that it's not at all the case. All your impressions were wrong. So then, of course, it could be a very positive experience. But these are all examples of growth. See, animals don't have this ability. A leopard cannot change its spots. And every animal has its rules. Human beings have the ability, the choice, the power to transcend themselves. And this is what the Midbar means, as I began earlier, that there's structures of our lives. There's what's below structure, that's a wilderness, but there's what's above structure. And to reach a place that's above structure, transcend structure, you have to, in some way, challenge and undermine the structure that you have. This is what's called rebellion, healthy rebellion. Healthy rebellion is when you rebel against the status quo, even coming from good people, even coming from healthy parents. It's learning to be independent. And learning to be independent means that you will challenge the structures around you. The unhealthy one is when it's coming from unhealthy places. It ends up being destructive to yourself. It's demoralizing. But a healthy challenge of structures always leads to great things. Einstein, sitting there as a postal clerk, challenged existing structures. And it's a very desolate place. It's a very lonely place because you'll be accused of being crazy, of being arrogant, but that's all greatness. Every great revelation came someone challenged an existing status quo, structure. Some challenge, as I said, not necessarily for good reasons, but there's no way to reach a place beyond structure. So, using Kabbalistic language, there's a thing called Seder Hishtalshelus. It's this what we call the cosmic structure. There's a structure to existence, a healthy structure, a structure put in place by God. This is called like civilization. That's a civilization. Then there are places where there is no structure, in the negative sense, when the structure is destroyed. So you have desolation. The Temple Mount is the desolate place today. The great sages, when they saw the Temple Mount, they saw the fox coming out of the place which was once the Holy of Holies, they started to cry. Because it was a place that was so saturated with Kedusha, with holiness. And now suddenly fox is running around, like a wilderness. It's like coming to a beautiful, beautiful structure that you once lived in, and you lived with the people you loved. You come, you see it's now it's in ruins. It's a very devastating thing to see because it's a place where this place where I used to stand, this is where I used to sit, this is where I loved you, and so on and so forth. So they cried. Rabbi Akiva, when he saw that place, he started to laugh. The Talmud tells us in the end of Makkas. And when they discussed why they were crying and they were laughing, because they said, look at this, the fulfillment of that curse or that prophecy, that one day this place will be desolate, like a wilderness. And when they asked Rabbi Akiva, so why are you laughing? So he said, because he continues to read another verse, that it says, from desolation will one day be a place that will turn into a place of beauty and flourish like never before. So what's the difference between them? Well, Rabbi Akiva is a person who did not grow up in comfort and did not grow up an easy life. At age 40, he first began to study Torah. So he knew what pain is. He knew what desolation was. He knew what ignorance was. And so he was able to see the process. The other scholars were people who grew up in scholarship. So when they saw desolation, they were devastated by it. He saw the process. And Rabbi Akiva, because he saw the process, he was able to identify this is a step. It looks very bad right now, but it's a step in the process of growth. Because when a building is raised with a Z, you could look at it as destruction, or you could look at it as making room for a greater building to be put in its place. Which is what the Zohar says, that the third temple will never be destroyed. But there could be never built a third eternal temple, as long as there's a temple there that's standing that could be destroyed. So when you see the destruction, it looks like destruction. But when you see the process, you know that there's something greater to be built here. And you'll see all the people in your life that inspire you, especially in times of difficult times, are the people who are able to, even though you may not see it at the moment, but they can see for you that no matter what you're going through, is a step in a process that will lead to a greater place. Those are the people we have to hold on to. So before we go to receiving the Torah at Sinai, we read about the Bamidbar, not to talk about destruction that is beneath the structure, but the destruction of one structure in order to bring a much greater structure and reach a place that's beyond structure. As I said earlier, when real love is expressed, it's beyond any expression. You may need words to begin the process, but ultimately you're reaching a place that's beyond. So the real challenge in a nutshell is, how do you hold on when you're in that place? When things seem desolate and alone on all levels, how do you hold on to see it through? That's the big question. So one of the simple ways is you don't hold on to yourself, you hold on to others. There's a story they tell about one of the Rebbes when he was in the concentration camps with a chassid of his. So there's a particular cruel commandant there who had this game, so-called game he liked to play with the Jews, where he got them to dig these wide trenches and then had them jump over the trenches. And those that could jump stayed alive, those that didn't were shot on the spot, and they ended up dead in the trenches. So this older Rebbe and chassid near him, chassid said to Rebbe, enough of this torture, let's just allow ourselves to be killed. And the Rebbe said, you can't do that. As long as God is keeping us alive, we have to do whatever we can. Well, they both actually did jump over, and they both survived. And after the liberation, they reunited. The chassid, they didn't even know they had both survived. The chassid said to the Rebbe said to the chassid, how did you make it? He said, well, when I jumped over, I just held on to your kapota. Actually, I gave you the punchline, the other way around. He asked the Rebbe, how did you make it when you jumped over the trench? You're an older man. So he said, what I did, I held on to the kapota of my father, my grandfather, and great-grandfather. Kapota is like the garment. In other words, spiritually speaking, he imagined that he has strength coming from a greater place. And then he asked the chassid, and how did you make it? So he says, I held on to your kapota. So in other words, we have to know how to hold on to each other. And sometimes, it's called, Im ein ani li mili, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But Im ani la'atzmi ma'ani. There are times where we have to acknowledge, and there's nothing wrong with acknowledging this, that we are vulnerable, and we can be hurt, and to have people who you really can trust, and find them, and hold on to them for your dear life. Because when times are difficult, and you can't see, one of the things you can't see is the process. Like the caterpillar does not see necessarily that it's going to become a butterfly. So what do you do about it? Beforehand, you establish connections with people that can help you in times like that. And I'm not saying that's easy to do, because that requires trust and requires effort, requires also a certain honesty. Some of us have pride. We don't want to feel that we're so-called weak, or others will see us as weak. That's one thing. And of course, the second thing is the famous rule that you always prepare in the years of plenty for the years of famine. That's what wise people do. Because we will all go through in somewhere in our lives a drought, a wilderness. That's a given. The wise people stockpile beforehand. Now, what do you stockpile? You stockpile on all levels. Knowledge, understanding this process. So though it may be cognitive at that point because you're not experiencing it, but cognitive preparation helps a person get through situations. As I mentioned before, most soldiers never fight a war. They spend most of the time training. But that training is necessary for that one time they may fight. They're ready for it. So cognitive preparation is an unbelievable tool for once you get into it. Unfortunately, most of us we don't anticipate, so we say, I'll do it tomorrow. But having an understanding of this process, and this is why we study it in Chassidus and in Kabbalah, the process of, I said, yesh, ayin, and yesh. The process that all forms of growth will always have a void, where one thing changes. The seed rots, decays in the ground before it grows into a beautiful flower. A mother goes through pains before she gives birth to a beautiful child. We all go through the awkwardness of adolescence. You have to melt a piece of gold to shape it into an ornament. Creativity is a child of frustration. The list goes on. The more you integrate that concept, the more you prepare yourself that when the war happens, in your case, when the day comes that you have to face your wilderness, you'll have at least mentally prepared yourself for that principle. And it definitely works. It's difficult, of course, once you're in the middle of the storm, or you're in the middle of that situation, you can't suddenly say, okay, now I'm going to go figure it out, because at that point, the emotions take over, and it's very difficult. So two things I mentioned so far. One is to hold on to the kapota. One is to hold on to others who can help us get through. And the second is preparing yourself cognitively. And of course, finally, I cannot neglect to mention maybe the strongest tool of all. It's called faith. We have emunah, and we have a thing called bitachon. Faith is faith, but bitachon even more is trust. You can believe in God, but it doesn't mean you trust in God. On the dollar, on American currency, it says in God we trust, not just in God we believe. Trust, as the Chovos HaLevavos and other Jewish scholars write, is a much more personal relationship. You believe in someone, you believe they can do it, but it doesn't mean you can do it. So the trust means that you know you have someone that you can trust, that you can rely on, that will help you. And that is something also that needs to be cultivated. You don't just get it overnight. You work on that. Well, sometimes it works the other way around, through negative. When you realize, as one Holocaust survivor once said, when someone asked him, a skeptic, how could you believe in God after the Holocaust? He said, you should ask the question, how could I believe in man after the Holocaust? The only thing I have left is now God, because man betrayed us. Man betrayed man. So the idea of building up a trust in a higher force is absolutely necessary, especially in times of a wilderness. Because ultimately, what really gave the Jews the power to go through this 40 years of a wilderness? It was because there was a Moses walking in front of them. There was a cloud of glory, a cloud of flame. There was a divine presence. They knew they were going somewhere. They had a destination to reach, a promised land. And yes, there are times that you see in the Torah where the Jews gave up. And they said, we have no going anywhere. We're going to our deaths. Let's go back. You have constantly that challenge because they didn't see it through. What was always the response? We were promised. When the Meraglim, the scouts, came back and said, we can't make it into the promised land. It's too powerful for us. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. The response was from Kalev, Ben Yefunah, and Yeshua and Joshua, was God promised it to us. In other words, the promise keeps us going. You'll see these three things, holding on to someone, or people who can, and cognitive preparation, and faith and trust, are always the three formulas. Look around of people who make it through, even the most difficult of wildernesses. And then, as I said earlier, which maybe is a fourth dimension, it's actually part of the cognitive thing, which is that there's a wilderness that is so-called negative, but there's a wilderness that's so-called positive. I don't know if you remember this, maybe we forget our teenage years, but I remember it very vividly. You grow up in school, so you have your friends you go to school with. And the delusions of children of school, and they think this is their world. And then there comes a point where you start becoming self-aware. And you start looking at your classmates, and some people you just don't identify with, people you went through school for 10 years, 15 years. And you start looking at the structures around you, your school, your establishment, the teachers, where at some point as a little child, you just accept whoever holds your hand and walks you through this, you accept. Because there comes a point where you begin to become independent. And there's a lot of things that happen at this stage. Some people rebel very severely. Some people get very disappointed. Some people get depressed. What's happening is that you're challenging the structures that you were part of, that shaped you. And it could be challenged in a way, as I said, that's destructive, but it could also be extremely healthy challenge. Because you begin to see through the corruption of it. You start seeing the hypocrisies. Some people, as I said, lose faith because they expected things and their expectations were not met. But some of us, and I include myself in that category, never had much expectations. So when you see these structures as they melt away, they're actually, at the time, it's not so easy to deal with, but then you begin to learn that you have to make it on your own. You cannot just rely on the structures around us. As I began this class, it said God did a tzedakah that He spread Jews all over the world. Because the structures of our time, after the temple was destroyed, are not necessarily healthy structures. So God said, you know what? I'm not going to give any structure a monopoly. Every structure has its virtue, but no one has a monopoly and say, this is it. We have to learn from each bit and piece of it. I can tell you from my own life, my own experiences, I've learned from people that are, the things I've learned most in my life are from people who come from backgrounds completely different than my own. I never took seriously the conformity that some people have to their communities. For me, freedom was always the ability to talk to people that are not like yourself and share ideas and actually be able to even disagree. People have completely different backgrounds. That's where you learn to become a real human being. You can stand up and have a discussion with someone that has a completely different background than your own. There are people who cannot stand being in a place where anybody there disagrees with them. They will only go to parties or events that are people like themselves, clones, where everybody laughs at the same jokes, everybody dismisses other communities equally, and they're very comfortable in that. To me, it was always pathetic to see that. There was always a sign of like complete brain, what's the word for it? Brainlessness, essentially, and comforts. Very easy. We all can get trapped in there. I'm sure I've gotten trapped there myself, but I try to be aware of it. So that's a healthy challenge of structure against structures. Now, is there any beauty in the structure? There may be. But if you deify it and you turn the structure into God, God is not structured. God is beyond the structure. The way Chassidus puts it is that the essence of God is beyond the state of Hishtalshus, beyond all structures. And that essence chose to create a structure. And that structure is part of existence and wants you to channel down the higher, the transcendent nature of existence that's beyond structure into the structure. Essentially, to reveal that the structure too is part of something beyond structure. If you don't do that and you become part of the structure, ultimately that structure will have to be destroyed in order to make room for something greater. So in a sense, the destruction, in the negative sense of the structure, is really a keli, is a container, is a stepping stone to reach the place that's beyond structure. You follow what I'm saying? So for instance, when the temple was standing, it was a beautiful holy temple, but it was losing its power because people were not so beautiful. The temple was a holy temple. People were not living up to it, took it for granted. They were divisive, corrupt. That's the case. This structure cannot exist in this world. So the temple was destroyed. So on one hand, you can say that destruction is a terrible thing, but on the other hand, it was a stepping stone. It revealed that the world was not ready for it. So sometimes when a person is destroyed in a negative way, it opens them up to be able to reach a place that's beyond all structures. That's the secret. That's why pain often is the key to the deepest revelations. Structure can be our trap, even healthy and noble structures. So with that being said, we read the chapter of Bamidbar, and it's a chapter that allows us to recreate the journey through our own wilderness. Everybody knows their own challenges, their own so-called desolate moments, and hold on to, as I said, friends, rabbis, anyone you can hold on to, kapot, and cognitive preparation, betachon, trust, and understanding that every destruction of a structure is always there to help build something greater and connect to the place that's beyond all structures. So in our own hearts and souls, we have all those dimensions. You have the structure of your life, you have the desolation of your life, you have the beyond the structure. And if you can relate to all of that, you can be a full human being. As I said before, when it comes to love and relationships, a real healthy relationship always has two elements to it. One is an essential component which has no structure, and another which is very structured. There are things you do for people you love, real practical things. It's not just a abstract love. It's practical things in this world. But the driving connection between people who love each other is always on an essential level that does not have real structure. Sometimes when a relationship has only structure to it, sadly, that structure will probably somewhere deteriorate because it's lacking the fundamental connection which is beyond all structures. Now, I hope this was not too abstract. I think, as they say, ten l'chacham v'yech kameid, which means you give wise people can make things even wiser. As I was leaving Israel this morning, I asked one of the rabbis who was at the airport. So I said, it says when you come to Israel, it says avir d'Eretz Yisrael is machkim. The avir, the environment, the air, oxygen, I guess, of Israel makes you wiser. So the question is, when you leave, does it also do the opposite? So I'm going to find out now that I'm back for a few hours, and we'll find out. I mean, you could buy those little cans of Israeli air. I don't know how long they last for, and the can makes the can wise. I guess it makes the business people wise. So I will share with you, as a concluding note, a nice humorous anecdote I heard in Jerusalem. It's about wisdom. It's really not connected to this discussion, but I just liked it. So you have this lawyer. It's about structures. That's really what it's about. So you have this attorney who's like a very arrogant, very successful, rich partner in a big law firm. And he meets one of these Jews who he is very condescending to. And he sees doesn't have the education that this lawyer has from Harvard Law School. And they get into this discussion. And he keeps on being like mocking him of how ignorant he is, how foolish he is, how this Jew. And the Jew is just, he's very not defending himself. He's playing along. So then the lawyer says, and the Jew says, but we're Jews, we have some seichel over the years, we got some seichel. So the lawyer says, yeah. Let's do a test. Here, I'll ask you a question. And if you can't answer it, you have to give me $5. And then you ask me a question. And if I can't answer, I'll give you $500. That's how confident he was. So he says, okay, let's go. So the lawyer says to the Jew, the high-powered lawyer says to the Jewish shlemazel, so to speak, Batlin, he says to him, okay, exactly how many miles are there between the sun and the earth? The Jew, shrugs his shoulders, takes out $5 and gives it to him. Okay. So then the Jew comes and says, now you ask me a question. The Jew says, okay. It climbs up a mountain with 3 legs, and when it comes down from the mountain, it has 4 legs. What is it? So the lawyer starts scratching his head. So, something rings true, something. I can't put my finger on it. And he's thinking 5 minutes, 10 minutes. After a while, he has to give up. He takes out $500 and gives it to him. And the Jew takes the 500 and goes off take a nap. The lawyer just can't handle it. He has to know what the answer was. So he starts bugging the Jew, and the Jew says, leave me alone, I'm tired. Well, finally, he wakes up, the Jew says, listen, I just can't, you got to tell me the answer. I gave you the 500. What is this thing that goes up with 3 legs and comes down with 4? So the Jew reaches in his pocket and gives him another $5. That's the story I heard. So with that being said, let me conclude this class. This is wisdom I bring to you from Israel. So the Jew ended up making $490. That's if you got your numbers right. It's good for the economy. So this class is dedicated, speedy recovery of Shraga Feivel, Ben Sora Risha, we wish him a refuah shleima. It's our own good Philip, right? Okay, so this is an announcement that Philip's class will not take place tomorrow due to, I guess, he's reaching to places that are beyond the structure, right? And he'll be back into the structure next week, hopefully. Sure, right? Okay. And so we're back on here. I said I bring you again warm regards from Jerusalem. We will have a class next Wednesday night, which will be like a pre-Shavuos class, because holiday starts Thursday night, right? So there will be a class, and then continue through the rest of the season. So again, I welcome everybody here, the new faces that have been here. If you have not left your email address, please do so, because firstly I send out a weekly email thought every week, and also updates of what's going on here. Constantly evolving, and as you see, and I welcome anybody who has any questions or any things you'd like to address. So we're here for you. Myself, Velvel, Golda Malka, Where's Eleanor? Eleanor is here somewhere? Eleanor. And of course, if anybody's interested in sponsoring a class or dedicating anything that can help us build the center here, we're still building different parts of it. There are different naming opportunities. If anyone is interested here, please see me or Eleanor. If you can wave again, Eleanor, right there. Okay. And of course also the web audience, which I never know who's out there. I say the same thing. So it's a pleasure seeing you all. And everyone have a very good night. Thank you.